You survived the shield wall. You survived the rain of iron. Your armies are broken, your fields are soaked in blood, but your heart is still beating. You think the worst is over. You think death on the battlefield was the ultimate price. You are wrong. In the ancient world, dying in armor was a luxury. A quick end. A clean exit. But for a defeated queen, Rome had a different plan. Rome did not want your corpse. Rome wanted your dignity. They wanted your legacy. They wanted to turn your entire life, your royal blood, and your sacred crown into a theater of humiliation. Imagine being kept alive, fed the finest meats, bathed in scented waters, and dressed in silk, not out of mercy, but because workers are currently paving a road in Italy specifically for your public degradation. Imagine realizing that the war was actually the easy part. This is the hidden horror of the Roman triumph. A system designed not to kill, but to erase. A ritualistic, calculated, prolonged nightmare that some queens feared so much, they chose to drink poison or vanish into the shadows rather than walk the streets of Rome in chains. The battlefield is quiet now. The screaming has stopped. The crows are circling. If you are a queen, this is the moment the true terror begins. A Roman soldier approaches you. He does not draw his sword. He does not strike you down. Instead, he bows. He offers you water. He treats you like royalty. It feels like mercy. It feels like civilized warfare. It is a trap. Rome had perfected a weapon far more destructive than the gladius. It was the triumph. Most people hear the word triumph and picture a parade. They see cheering crowds, marching soldiers, and laurel wreaths. They see a celebration of victory. But that is the surface. That is the lie Rome told to the world. Beneath the music and the gold lay a cold, industrial psychological machine. The triumph was not a celebration. It was policy. It was a massive, city-scale ritual designed to perform the complete destruction of a human soul. And for a conquered queen, it was a fate far worse than execution. Think about the mechanics of this cruelty. When Rome defeated an enemy, they did not just want to occupy land. Land can be retaken. They did not just want to collect taxes. Taxes can be withheld. They wanted to break the very idea of resistance. They wanted to prove, to every province and every watching eye, that challenging Rome was not just a mistake, it was an impossibility. To do this, they needed the ruler alive. The process began long before the parade. The moment a queen was captured, she entered a state of golden captivity. She was placed in a villa. She was given servants. She was provided with the clothes of her station. To the outside world, it looked like Rome was honoring a noble adversary. But the psychological torture was immense. Day after day, week after week, the captured queen sat in her comfortable prison, knowing exactly what was happening across the sea. In Rome, the architects were moving. Workers were clearing the streets. Artists were painting massive canvases depicting her defeat, her armies running away, her cities burning. Carpenters were building floats that would carry her stolen treasures. She was being fattened for the slaughter. Not a physical slaughter, but a social one. Rome understood something most empires missed. If you kill a queen on the battlefield, she becomes a symbol. She becomes a martyr. Her people remember her bravery. Her children inherit her rage. Her story ends with a heroic exclamation point. But if you bring her to Rome, if you force her to walk through the mud, if you make her look small, weak, and broken in front of a million screaming citizens, you rewrite the story. You turn a hero into a joke. You turn a legend into entertainment. The entire empire would gather to watch. High-born senators, low-born laborers, women, children, thousands of eyes fixed on one person. The pressure of a crowd can crush a spirit faster than iron. For the queens who understood Roman history, this waiting period was the real battlefield. It was a countdown to absolute erasure. They knew that every luxury provided to them by their captors was just a prop for the upcoming show. They were no longer rulers. They were no longer humans. They were property of the Roman state, waiting for the curtain to rise on their own destruction. Which silent torture did Rome build before the parade began? A. A golden cage. B. A paved road. C. A concrete wall. D. A silent room. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. Some queens looked at the grand design of Rome and refused to play their part. They realized the ultimate truth: the only way to win against a Roman triumph was to deny them the body. To remove yourself from the script entirely. Enter Boudica. It is AD 60 in the damp, cold forests of Britain. Boudica, the warrior queen of the Iceni, has watched her world shatter. Her husband died, believing Roman oversight would protect his daughters. Instead, Roman officials arrived like vultures. They stripped her people of their lands. They treated royalty like property. When Boudica protested, Rome did not argue. They acted. They flogged her publicly. They assaulted her daughters. This was not an accident of war. There was no rebellion yet. This was Rome establishing the hierarchy. A queen reduced to a slave in front of her own tribe. Royal blood publicly degraded. The message was clear: you are nothing. But Rome miscalculated the cost of fury. Boudica did not submit. She burned. Her uprising was a tidal wave of vengeance. Roman settlements were erased. Camulodunum, Londinium, Verulamium, all turned to ash. For weeks, the ground of Britain drank Roman blood. The empire trembled because its entire authority rested on a single, unspoken assumption: Rome always wins eventually. Boudica was breaking that assumption in real time. But the Roman machine was disciplined, heavy, and patient. The end came on a narrow field. Outnumbered but perfectly organized, the Roman legions formed a wall of iron. The tribal forces broke against it. The retreat turned into a slaughter. Thousands died, crushed under their own supply wagons. Somewhere in that chaos, Boudica stood looking at the wreckage of her empire. She knew what was coming. She knew the Roman manual of victory by heart. If she stayed on the field, she would not be granted a clean death. The soldiers would guard her with their lives. They would secure her in chains. She would be carried across the channel, placed on a ship, and fed well during the long journey to Italy. She would be forced to stand in the sun while the crowd mocked her red hair and her tall frame. She would become a prop in the theater of her enemy. So, she made a choice. She did not wait for the Roman cavalry to surround her. She reached into her robes. She pulled out a small vial. Poison. By drinking that fluid, Boudica fought her final, most successful battle. When the liquid burned through her veins, she was not running away from execution. She was sabotaging a Roman ritual. She was stealing the main attraction from their grand parade. Imagine the frustration of the Roman generals when they found her cold body. The battlefield was won, but the triumph was damaged. They had the land, they had the gold, but they did not have the queen. They could not display her despair. Other rulers chose an even darker route: total disappearance. They stepped off the pages of history completely. They retreated into the deep mist of the interior lands or changed their names, leaving no graves, no records, no satisfaction for the Roman state. They understood that to be forgotten by history was a tragedy, but to be remembered as a humiliated captive of Rome was a living damnation. For these queens, suicide was not an act of despair. It was an act of supreme political resistance. It was the only way a conquered ruler could still control the ending of their own story. But some queens did not get to choose the poison. Some queens were caught by surprise, intercepted by the brutal speed of Roman iron. For them, the curtain rose, and the stage was set. 2 centuries after Boudica, deep in the sun-drenched sands of the east, another woman rose to defy the empire. Her name was Zenobia, Queen of Palmyra. And unlike the tribal leaders of the West, Zenobia did not just raid Roman borders. She built an empire within an empire. She was brilliant. She spoke multiple languages. She studied philosophy. She was politically ruthless. While Rome was fracturing during the crisis of the 3rd century, Zenobia stepped into the vacuum. She seized Syria. She took Asia Minor. She marched her armies into Egypt, the literal breadbasket of Rome. She cut off the grain supply. She printed coins with her own face. She was ruling over Rome's wealthiest territories under her own absolute authority. To the Emperor Aurelian, this was not just an insurrection. This was an existential threat. Zenobia was proving that Rome could be broken apart piece by piece. The Roman response was swift and devastating. Aurelian marched east with the full weight of the legions. Cities that supported Zenobia were besieged. Her allies saw the shifting winds and vanished into the desert. Her supply lines collapsed under the weight of the Roman advance. Finally, her capital of Palmyra was surrounded. Zenobia was a strategist. She knew when a wall was about to fall. In the dead of night, she slipped out of the city. She mounted a swift camel and fled east toward the Euphrates River. Her goal was Persian territory. If she could cross the river, she could secure Persian wealth, rebuild her army, and fight another day. She reached the banks of the river. The water was right in front of her. She was seconds away from freedom. Then came the sound of hooves. Roman cavalry, tracking her scent through the sand, intercepted her right at the water's edge. Before she could step onto the boat, iron hands pulled her down. In a single instant, the woman who ruled the East stopped being an empress. She became property of the Roman state. The military victory was complete, but for Aurelian, the real work was just beginning. He did not execute her in the desert. He needed the ritual. He needed the performance. Zenobia was shipped to Rome, kept under heavy guard, and prepared for the grandest triumph the city had seen in decades. When the day arrived, the parade route through the city was choked with thousands of screaming spectators. The air smelled of incense and sweat. Wagons rolled past, piled high with the legendary treasures of Palmyra, silks, gems, statues, and weapons. But the crowd was not waiting for the gold. They were waiting for the centerpiece. They were waiting for her. According to ancient accounts, when Zenobia stepped onto the stones of the parade route, she was not wearing rags. Rome did not want her to look like a beggar, they wanted her to look like a fallen giant. She was dressed in her full imperial regalia. But around her neck, her wrists, and her ankles, Rome had placed chains. Not iron chains. Gold chains. Think about the sheer psychological cruelty of that decision. Rome used wealth itself as an instrument of torture. The chains of gold were so massive, so thick, and so incredibly heavy that the Queen of Palmyra could barely take a single step forward. She stumbled under the weight of her own status. Her royal jewels, her crown, her heritage, everything that once symbolized her absolute power was transformed into physical weight, dragging her through the dirt. As she struggled to stay upright, assistants had to walk beside her, physically lifting the heavy gold links so she wouldn't collapse into the mud. The crowd roared with laughter and mockery. To the Roman citizens, this was the ultimate theater. It was the East, with all its luxury and pride, being crushed under the heavy boots of Latin discipline. Zenobia walked for hours, her feet bleeding, her body exhausted, forced to participate in the public celebration of her own ruin. Every step she took was a message written in gold and blood: look at what Rome does to queens. When the sun finally set on Zenobia's parade, the shouting died down. The crowds packed up and went home. The streets were littered with trampled flowers, dropped food, and the heavy scent of spent incense. For most people, the story ends when the parade stops. But for Rome, the most sinister part of the machine was just starting to turn. What happens to a queen when the theater is over? Standard Roman procedure was efficient and cold. Most high-profile male captives were taken directly from the parade to the Tullianum, a dark, subterranean stone chamber beneath the Roman Forum. There, in the pitch black, away from the eyes of the world, they were quietly strangled by the executioner. It was a utilitarian end to a public spectacle. But for Zenobia, Rome chose a path that was infinitely more complex. They did not kill her. They kept her alive. According to historical records, Emperor Aurelian granted Zenobia a beautiful, sprawling villa in Tibur, a wealthy resort town just outside Rome. She was given a generous pension. She was surrounded by servants. She was invited to high-society Roman gatherings. To a casual observer, this looked like the ultimate display of Roman mercy and enlightenment. The empire was showing the world how generous it could be to its fallen enemies. But look closer at the psychological anatomy of that mercy. It was not kindness. It was absolute neutralization. By giving Zenobia a comfortable, quiet life as a Roman matron, Rome accomplished something far more permanent than an execution. If they had strangled her in the Tullianum, she might have remained a symbol of Eastern defiance. Her memory could have simmered in Syria, a spark waiting to reignite a future rebellion. But a queen living in a Roman villa, drinking Roman wine, and attending Roman dinner parties is no longer a threat. She is no longer an empress. She is a house pet. She became a living exhibit of Roman dominance. Every time a Roman aristocrat visited her villa or saw her at a social gathering, they were reminded of the empire's total victory. She was living proof that the great queen of Palmyra had been successfully tamed, broken, and integrated into the system. The erasure went even deeper. Zenobia's children did not inherit her desert empire. They were absorbed directly into the Roman aristocracy. They were given Roman educations. They spoke Latin. They married into wealthy Roman families. Her bloodline, the royal line that had once commanded armies and cut off Rome's grain supply, was systematically diluted, washed away, and repurposed into the machinery of the state that had conquered her. Her empire was dismantled, its borders redrawn, its wealth absorbed. And Zenobia spent the rest of her days watching it happen from her beautiful prison, fully aware that her identity was being slowly dissolved into the vast expanse of the Roman world. Rome had discovered the ultimate secret of imperial survival: killing a ruler ends a chapter, but absorbing them and rewriting their story ensures they can never rise again. Long before Zenobia walked in her golden weights, there was another queen who loomed larger in the Roman imagination than any other. A woman who represented the ultimate prize. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. To understand the scale of Rome's obsession with Cleopatra, you have to understand what Egypt was to the Roman mind. It was not just another province. It was an ancient, dizzyingly wealthy kingdom. Its grain fed the Roman masses, its gold filled the dreams of Roman generals. And Cleopatra had spent her entire life using her immense intellect, political acumen, and strategic alliances to keep that massive Roman machine at bay. She had charmed Julius Caesar. She had allied with Mark Antony. She had played the dangerous game of Roman civil wars and won for years. But then came the Battle of Actium. The naval clash broke her power. Antony's fleet was shattered. Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, watching from her palace walls as the legions of Octavian, the cold, calculating future first emperor of Rome, closed in around her kingdom like a tightening noose. Piece by piece, her world evaporated. Mark Antony, broken by false rumors of her demise, fell upon his own sword, dying in her arms. Suddenly, Cleopatra was alone in her monumental tomb, surrounded by her remaining treasures, with Octavian's forces at her doorstep. Octavian sent messengers. He offered terms. He spoke of mercy, of protection, of safety for her children. He desperately wanted her alive. But Cleopatra was not an outsider looking into Roman politics, she had lived it. She had walked the streets of Rome years before. She understood the language of Roman diplomacy, and more importantly, she understood the mechanics of the Roman triumph. She knew exactly what Octavian's mercy meant. It meant a cage. Historical evidence suggests that Octavian's planners in Rome were already working on the logistics of his triumph over Egypt. They were designing the floats. They were calculating how the wealth of the Ptolemies would be displayed. And the crown jewel of that entire multi-day performance was supposed to be Cleopatra herself. Not hidden away, but displayed. Walking behind Octavian's chariot, stripped of her sovereignty, paraded before the very Roman citizens who had spent years listening to state propaganda calling her a foreign witch and an Eastern degenerate. She realized that the performance of her destruction was already written. If she surrendered, she would be handing Octavian the final, definitive scene of his political masterpiece. So, she staged her own ending. In August of 30 BC, inside her sealed mausoleum, Cleopatra denied Rome its climax. Whether through the bite of an asp hidden in a basket of figs, or a poisoned hairpin, she chose death on her own terms. When Octavian's guards finally broke through the doors, they did not find a desperate captive ready to be processed by the imperial machine. They found a dead queen, dressed in her finest royal robes, seated upon a golden throne. It was a devastating political strike. By dying, Cleopatra committed the ultimate act of sabotage against the incoming regime. She pulled herself off the stage, leaving Octavian with a military victory but a hollow triumph. But the cruelty of Rome was nothing if not adaptive. If the empire could not have the living queen, they would manufacture one. When Octavian finally celebrated his grand triumph in the streets of Rome, the crowd still got their show. In the center of the procession, where Cleopatra was supposed to walk, the Romans carried a massive, lifelike effigy, a statue of the dead queen, crafted to look exactly like her, with a painted serpent coiled around her arm. They paraded a corpse made of wood and stone through the mud so the citizens could still scream their insults, still throw their stones, and still feel the rush of total dominance. And then came the truest, most heartbreaking horror of the Roman system. Cleopatra had escaped the physical parade, but she could not protect her family. Walking directly behind that cold, lifeless effigy of their mother were her 3 young children, Cleopatra Selene, Alexander Helios, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. They were twins just 10 years old, and a little boy even younger. They were dressed in the traditional royal garments of Egypt, wearing heavy chains, forced to walk through the deafening roar of thousands of hostile strangers who cheered at the destruction of their house. The oldest son, Caesar Ion, Cleopatra's child with Julius Caesar, had already been hunted down and executed on Octavian's orders. He possessed too much symbolic power, too dangerous a bloodline to live. But the younger children were kept alive for a specific purpose. They were the living exclamation points at the end of Egypt's independent history. After the parade, they did not face the executioner. Instead, they were handed over to Octavian's sister, Octavia, to be raised in a Roman household. They were stripped of their Egyptian heritage, taught to think like Romans, and systematically neutralized. Cleopatra Selene was eventually married off to a client king in North Africa, a foreign queen's daughter turned into a reliable asset of the Roman administrative machine. Her brothers simply faded from the historical record, their identities erased not by violence, but by the quiet, steady pressure of assimilation. Even in her grave, Cleopatra had to watch the empire absorb her flesh and blood, turning her legacy into a footnote of Roman expansion. To truly understand the fate these queens fought so desperately to avoid, you have to leave the sunlit avenues of the parade routes. You have to step away from the marble villas and the golden chains. You have to descend into the damp, cold belly of Rome itself. Beneath the heavy stones of the Roman Forum lay the Tullianum, the Mamertine prison. It was not a modern penitentiary. There were no cells, no yards, no windows to catch the changing of the seasons. It was a subterranean network of stone chambers, dark, wet, and thick with the smell of old rot. The lowest room was accessible only through a small, circular hole in the ceiling. This was the final stop for the captives who survived the grand spectacles above. Imagine the psychological transition. 1 hour, you are standing in the blinding Mediterranean sun, dressed in imperial silk and gold, surrounded by the deafening roar of a million screaming human beings. The next hour, the parade is over. The crowd has moved on to the wine shops and the taverns. The guards push you into the dark. They tie a rope around your waist. They lower you through that narrow hole into the absolute silence of the earth. This was the cold reality of Roman policy. Once your value as entertainment was completely drained, the empire had no more use for your breath. This was the dark pit where Vercingetorix, the great king of the Gauls who had united his people to resist Julius Caesar, spent his final hours before the executioner's cord tightened around his throat. This was the stone chamber where Jugurtha, the fierce Numidian king who had fought the legions through the desert sands for years, was thrown naked into the dark to slowly starve to death. When you stand in that ancient room today, the dampness still clings to the stone. It is a monument to absolute, unyielding state power. This was the concrete nightmare that drove Boudica to the poison vial. This was the reality that Cleopatra defied with her final, regal pose on her golden couch. This was the fate that Zenobia narrowly escaped by allowing her identity to be quietly dissolved into the fabric of Roman society. For centuries, this horrific system worked. The triumphs terrified watching nations. The public executions in the marketplaces of imperial China, the ceremonial captivity atop the great temples of the Aztec Empire, the deliberate display of the Zulu king Sechueo through the high society drawing rooms of Victorian London, all of these across human history were variants of the exact same calculation. They discovered that killing an enemy ruler in battle merely ends a war. But capturing them, displaying them, making the entire world watch their slow, systematic reduction from gods to property, that creates an entirely different kind of ending. A permanent one. But human history is an unstable machine. Empires build monuments out of stone, believing that because they control the ink and the canvas today, they control the truth forever. They forget that the performance of extreme cruelty leaves a psychological scar on the world that time refuses to heal. Rome wanted erasure. They wanted these queens to be remembered as small, broken, and defeated footnotes in the grand story of Latin expansion. They wanted the world to look at the statue of Cleopatra or the golden chains of Zenobia and see only the triumph of the eagle. But look at what actually happened when the dust cleared. The Roman Empire fractured. The legions marched into oblivion. The marble temples of the Forum collapsed into ruin, and the names of the emperors who celebrated those magnificent triumphs became trivia for scholars. But the queens? The women they tried so brutally to turn into temporary theater? They broke through the script. Boudica, forgotten in the damp soil of Britain for a millennium, was dug up by memory and transformed into a towering national symbol of resistance, her statue now standing proud right in the heart of London, facing the very sky she once filled with smoke. Zenobia became a legendary icon of defiance, celebrated by Renaissance writers and desert storytellers alike as the woman who made the masters of the world tremble for their borders. Cleopatra's name is known in every corner of the modern globe, her intelligence and defiance surviving 2,000 years of imperial propaganda designed to make her look weak. The ultimate irony of the Roman triumph is that the very magnitude of the theater, the sheer, theatrical scale of the humiliation they engineered, made these women unforgettable. By spending so much energy, wealth, and architecture to perform their destruction, Rome accidentally immortalized the very people it was trying to erase. The empire won the battles. They controlled the streets. They owned the execution docks and the historical records written immediately after the slaughter. But they lost the only war that carries weight across generations, the war for human memory. They wanted to create a cautionary tale. Instead, they built a lineage of martyrs. Because long after the stone walls of the Tullianum have become dust, and long after the empires of the earth have vanished into the shadows, one simple truth remains written in the DNA of human history: the system is temporary, but defiance survives. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.